In one of the shops of old Europe stood a locked cabinet. Not with gold, not with precious stones, with a white powder. The apothecary would scoop it out with a tiny spoon, weigh it grain by grain, and sell it by weight, as if it were the most precious medicine. Only kings, dukes, and very wealthy merchants could afford it. That powder was ordinary sugar. Now compare. Today, the average person on the planet eats more than 20 kilograms of sugar a year and doesn't even think about it. What once cost entire fortunes now sits in our homes in a plain paper packet. So how did the sweet grass travel from a locked cabinet to the kitchen shelf? This is the story of a taste that turned the world upside down. It all began very long ago and very far away, on the island of New Guinea, in a warm and humid land where tall cane grows. About 8,000 years ago, the local people noticed something. If you broke open a thick stalk and chewed it, sweetness flooded your mouth. No factories, no kettles, just a piece of a plant and the astonished smile of a person tasting real sweetness for the first time, not from honey, but from ordinary grass. People grew so fond of this cane that they began carrying it with them. Daring seafarers in light boats set out into the open ocean and took shoots of cane along as precious cargo. That's how the sweet plant spread across the islands of the Pacific and reached Southeast Asia. But for now, it was still just a sweet stick to chew. The real transformation lay ahead. The true turning point came in India. There, even hundreds of years before our era, people figured out how to do the impossible. They began squeezing the juice from the cane and then boiling it down slowly over a fire. The water vanished, and at the bottom of the vessel hard, sweet grains were left behind. People had learned to turn sugar into crystals. Now it could be stored, carried for thousands of kilometers, and there was no fear of it spoiling. In India, this miracle also got a name. In the ancient language of Sanskrit, it was called sharkara. The word proved so durable that it has survived to our day. From it come the English sugar and many other names for sugar around the world. And Indian doctors didn't consider sugar a simple treat. In old medical books, it was prescribed as a remedy for weakness, for illness, to restore one's strength. The whole world gradually learned of this mysterious sweetness, and everyone described it in their own way. In the West, in ancient Rome, a scholar named Pliny the Elder wrote of it almost as a marvelous wonder. He said that somewhere far away, in India and Arabia, there was a special honey that was gathered straight from the cane and used as medicine. To a Roman, this sounded almost like a fairy tale, sweetness growing inside a stalk. In the East, a real hunt began for the secret of sugar. China was ruled by an emperor named Taizong. He wanted so badly to learn how sugar was made that he sent an entire mission to the distant Indian kingdom to uncover the secret. This happened in the year 647. Together with merchants and travelers, Buddhist monks brought the skill of cooking sugar into China. And so the recipe for sweet crystals crossed yet another border. But sugar truly conquered the world thanks to the Arabs. From the 7th to the 13th century, they brought the art of refining almost to perfection. They learned to make it cleaner, whiter, and more beautiful. And, most importantly, they carried cane to the warm shores of the Mediterranean, to Egypt, to the island of Sicily, to Cyprus, to southern Spain, to flourishing cities like Valencia and Granada. Where grapes had once grown and olive groves had stood, sugar fields now rustled. It was from the Arabs that familiar words came into our languages. From their sukar comes the very word sugar. And the sweet candy we call candy, or caramel, preserves the memory of the Arabic kondi. Then knights reached out for sugar too. During their long campaigns, the Crusaders saw the sugar estates on the eastern shore of the sea with their own eyes, tasted the sweetness, and brought a love for it back home to cold Europe. And the main gateway for sugar became the wealthy Italian Cornaro family from Venice. They owned enormous sugar plantations on the island of Cyprus, and one woman of this family, Caterina Cornaro, rose so high that she became the actual queen of the island. Sugar brought in so much money that it opened the way to crowns. In Europe, sweet gold became, once and for all, a sign of wealth. It decorated the tables of the nobility, and entire sculptures were molded from it, castles, figures, flowers, which were shown off before guests. In the shops it lay beside expensive spices, under reliable guard. Things even reached the absurd. The English Queen Elizabeth I loved sugar so much that her teeth darkened and turned black from sweets. In the year 1598, a German traveler who had visited the court recorded this directly in his notes. And do you know what happened next? Courtiers began to envy her. Black teeth briefly became a fashionable sign of wealth. The idea being that if your teeth were ruined by sugar, then you could afford it in huge quantities. Illness was masquerading as luxury, but sweet gold had one great misfortune. Cane needs warmth, plenty of sun, moisture, and a long, hot summer. In cool Europe, it simply wouldn't grow. And demand climbed higher every year. People wanted more and more sugar, and it could only be obtained from far away by costly and dangerous sea routes. Wealth lay close at hand. All you had to do was find warm land where cane could be grown without end. And when Europe set out to find such land across the ocean, the darkest chapter in the history of sugar began, the one for which humanity would pay a terrible price. Sugar set people a difficult task. It brought in fabulous amounts of money, but it would only consent to grow in warmth. And so, Europe made a terrible choice. If the cane couldn't be brought to cold countries, then people had to be brought to warm ones. So begins the darkest chapter of this sweet story, a chapter in which behind every spoonful of sugar stand the tears of strangers. The first to take up the task was small but daring Portugal. In the 15th century, its ships sailed ever farther into the ocean, and sailors found new islands there. On one of them, which they named Madeira, the first sugar plantations were laid out in the 1420s. The money for this came from wealthy merchants in Italian Genoa. They immediately caught the scent of profit. Then the Portuguese pushed south and found an island right off the coast of Africa, São Tomé. And there's something happened that would later be repeated thousands of times. At first, the plantations were worked by exiles, criminals, and the poor, but their labor wasn't enough, and the owners decided to use enslaved Africans, people who were taken by force from their homeland. São Tomé became a cruel template, a dark blueprint for the future. Here, for the first time, sugar, the island, and bondage were fused into one. But the true heart of this system was not the islands, but the vast land across the ocean, Brazil. In the 1530s, the Portuguese carried their terrible order there. On fertile lands called Pernambuco and Bahia, they built sugar mills. They called them engenhos. And business went so briskly that by the beginning of the 17th century, Brazil had become the largest producer of sugar in the whole world. Sweet grains poured into Europe in a river. And behind that river stood a real hell. Work on the plantation drained the very last drop of strength. Under the scorching tropical sun, people hacked at the tall, tough cane with heavy knives, hour after hour, day after day, without rest. Then the stalks were taken to the mill, where heavy rollers crushed them and squeezed out the sweet juice. The machines were so dangerous that an axe was kept beside them at all times, in case a person got caught in the mechanism. And further on, in the boiling houses, huge cauldrons in which the juice was turned into sugar boiled around the clock. Heat, exhaustion, danger. And so it went every single day, with no hope of rest. Meanwhile, across the ocean, it was no longer cauldrons that boiled, but wars. Sugar brought in such wealth that entire states fought over the plantations. The Dutch seized Brazilian Pernambuco and held it for more than 20 years, from 1630 to 1654. They were driven out, but they took the most important thing with them, the knowledge of how to set up sugar mills. And they carried that skill across the Caribbean islands. So new sugar lands rose up, the island of Barbados, and after it the English and French possessions. The richest of them all was the French colony of Saint-Domingue. It almost sounds unbelievable. A single island produced about 40% of all the sugar in the world. Nearly every other spoonful of sweetness on European tables was born there. But behind that gleam hid a price that's terrifying to say out loud. Brazil alone took in around 5 million enslaved Africans, more than any other country on earth. Out of every 5 people forcibly carried across the ocean, 2 ended up right there. And the plantation owners reasoned so coldly and so cruelly, it's hard to believe. They thought it cheaper to buy a new person than to preserve the life of the one already working. That's why historians put it plainly. Sugar didn't merely make use of slavery, it gave birth to it. It was for the sake of those sweet crystals that the enormous trade in human beings spun up between 3 shores, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And sugar itself became the most valuable commodity Britain imported. Sweet gold was kneaded together with someone else's grief. But people didn't stay silent, they fought back. The most powerful blow against this system was struck on the island of Jamaica. In December of 1831, an uprising broke out there that came to be called the Christmas Rebellion, or the Baptist War. At its head stood an unusual man, a preacher by the name of Samuel Sharp. He was not a warrior, but a man of faith, and he called people to freedom. Tens of thousands of enslaved people rose to his call. The uprising was put down brutally, and Sharp himself was executed in 1832. But it was too late. The scale of that revolt so shook all of Britain that ordinary people in England itself began demanding an end to slavery. And here history takes an important turn. Even earlier, in 1807, the British Empire had banned the trade in human beings. And in 1833, slavery itself. You'd think justice had triumphed. But what comes next is a detail that makes your skin crawl. The state paid out an enormous sum, £20 million, nearly half the country's entire annual budget. Only it wasn't the freed people who received it. It went to more than 40,000 former slaveholders as compensation for their lost property. And the debt the Treasury took on to pay off those owners, Britain kept paying down for so long that it wasn't fully settled until 2015, which means that Britons alive only recently were, through their taxes, still topping up that old bill. And so, while the old system was crumbling across the ocean, in cold Europe, a new hope was quietly ripening. It turned out sweetness could be produced without the tropics. Back in 1747, the German scientist Andreas Marggraf had spotted in the ordinary beet, the kind that grows in vegetable gardens, exactly the same sugar found in cane. His student Franz Achard went further. With the backing of the Prussian king, he opened the world's first beet sugar factory in 1801 in a place called Cunern. And what really pushed the new industry forward were the wars. When the General Napoleon cut Europe off from overseas cane, people threw themselves into beet in earnest. And by 1813, in France alone, there were already hundreds of such factories. The 1,000-year reign of cane had been shaken. A new era was beginning, the era of cheap sugar for everyone. And so sugar, which for thousands of years had been a sweet luxury for the chosen few, suddenly became cheap. What once cost entire fortunes was now within reach of almost anyone. It seems like the happy ending of the story, but this is exactly where its most cunning and most dangerous part begins. the part where sweetness quietly turns against us. First, sugar got cheaper thanks to clever machines. It used to be boiled over an open fire, with a lot of product lost in the process. Then, in 1813, a man named Edward Charles Howard came up with a special apparatus in which sugar could be boiled at low temperature, gently and without losses. A bit later, in 1843, another invention came from Norbert Rillieux, a free man from New Orleans. His ingenious system saved fuel and time so cleverly that its principle still lies at the heart of sugar mills today. White, perfectly clean sugar came to seem to people like a mark of purity and a new modern life. And then sugar found a faithful companion, tea. In 1846, Britain abolished the special taxes on sugar, and prices crashed down to almost nothing. Sweet tea, jam, condensed milk suddenly became affordable not just for the rich but for ordinary workers too. A mug of hot sweet tea warmed you up, gave you strength, and cost pennies. For someone who stood at a machine all day, this was a real lifesaver. Quick energy right there in a glass. So sugar quietly slipped in everywhere. It became cheap fuel for the people who worked hard in the factories. A handful of sweetness, and you could keep going. Without it, the huge factories and fast trains of that era simply wouldn't have hummed along so briskly. Next, the story crosses the ocean, to America, and there the real festival of sweetness begins. In 1894, a man named Milton Hershey began making milk chocolate, and before long the sweet bars were everywhere you looked. During the Great War, chocolate was packed into soldiers' rations as a source of quick energy. In the mornings, children wolfed down cereal sprinkled with sugar. And by the early 70s of the last century, the average American was eating more than 50 kilograms of sweets a year. This was no longer a treat for holidays. It was a whole way of life. And here's where the most troubling part begins. For a long time, nobody really gave any thought to whether sugar was harmful. But in 1972, the British scientist John Yudkin wrote a book with a frightening title, Pure, White, and Deadly. In it, he warned bluntly, the main threat to the heart isn't fat, as everyone had gotten used to thinking, but sugar. You'd think this would be a vital discovery, but Yudkin wasn't listened to. He was pushed aside, declared a crank, and a different idea came into fashion, that fat was to blame for everything. For decades, people believed salvation lay in fat-free food and went right on calmly eating sweets, and meanwhile, another unpleasant secret lay buried out of sight. In the late 60s, a certain sugar foundation quietly paid for animal experiments. Scientists ran the trials and noticed troubling things, hints that sugar might be linked to heart disease and even to cancer. And what did the foundation do when it found out? It simply shut the work down and didn't publish anything. The inconvenient results were tucked away in a drawer. Only in 2017 did scientists from California find those old papers and tell the world about them. It turned out almost like with tobacco, when the truth about the harm was hidden for years for the sake of profit. And then an even cheaper replacement was found for sugar. In the late 60s, the Japanese scientist Yoshiyuki Takasaki perfected a special substance that made it possible to produce sweet syrup straight from corn. And a little later, American government policy made corn extremely cheap, while keeping cane sugar expensive. Manufacturers quickly figured out which was more profitable. By the mid-80s, even the famous sodas had switched over to this corn syrup, and before long it turned up in nearly every ready-made food on store shelves. And here's where we've landed today. Doctors at the world's main health organization advise you should eat very little sugar a day, about 25 grams, roughly 6 teaspoons, and ideally even less. But in reality, people eat 2 or even 3 times that much. and not because they're endlessly dumping sugar into their tea. The trouble is that it hides where you'd never expect it: in ketchup, in ordinary bread, in healthy yogurts, in sports bars. A single can of soda contains around 35 to 40 grams. That's almost 9 teaspoons in one go, more than the daily limit in a single gulp. The reckoning is already plain to see. Around the world, more and more people are struggling with excess weight, and the serious illness tied to blood sugar is now part of daily life for over 500 million adults on the planet. The sweetness that once healed has itself become a source of disease. People are trying to fight back. Different countries have come up with special taxes on sweets and soda to make people buy them less often. In some places, big dark warnings are slapped right on the packaging. Careful, too much sugar in here. Even individual cities are bringing in their own rules against sugary drinks. The only problem is that the huge sugar industry spends serious money to keep such measures from passing. It's a tough fight. When you really think about it, the story of sugar comes full circle. A modest grass from the distant island of New Guinea, which people simply chewed for its sweet taste 10,000 years ago, has traveled an incredible path. It built fairy tale fortunes and shattered millions of lives. It moved ships, reshaped entire nations, and redrew the map of the world. And now that very same grass sits quietly on your kitchen shelf, in a bag of sugar, in a can of soda, in ketchup, in bread, in your morning cereal. Quiet, familiar, unnoticed. It's no longer locked away in a cabinet under guard. On the contrary, it's everywhere. And maybe the most powerful thing we can do, after all this long and complicated history, is simply take a closer look at the label and, for the first time, really notice it.